Why hello there, yes I know, I've got a lot of mice, I've got a problem. This is a review of the Logitech G203 Lightsync. In this review I'll be talking about its performance in terms of ergonomics, how it compares to other mice out there, and specifically how it compares to the original G203 non-Lightsync variant. Now this mouse can be found for around £30 in the UK and around $40 in the US. If you live in these territories or indeed elsewhere, the locally link in the description below will take you to your localized Amazon store. So let's get into it. So first off, let's talk about design. The mouse has somewhat of an ambidextrous design, and yes, of course, it's got those glowy RGB lights that my camera is somewhat struggling to pick up. Now, the mouse can be held in your right hand or left hand, but you will have to bear in mind that the buttons are on the left hand side over here, so therefore more suited for a right-hander. You've also got a top button over here, which is great to see, and then you've also got your default left button and right button. And don't worry, I'll get into a ASMR section in just a bit. Now the RGB lights can be fully customized, so you don't have to worry about that. I will get into the software section where you'll be able to see all the customization options. Underneath you've got 4 rubber mouse pads, which allow you to basically go and smoothly go around a surface. And then you've got a very long cable. I must say that the cable was extremely long and very surprising. I had no issues in terms of trailing on my soft mouse pad or my hard surface over here. It is worth bearing in mind that it's a far better design than the old school Logitech one, which is somewhat braided and does get very frayed very easily. Now in terms of its sizing, now my hand is around 18 to 17 centimeters from the top to the bottom, around 8 centimeters in terms of width, and you can see in terms of how it looks like in my hand. It's a pretty small mouse, at least in my opinion. I would say it's perfect for claw grippers and borderline if you're fingertip grip. I mean, again, it depends on the size of your hand. If you've got smaller hands, then it might fit you better. This is all subjective, but you can see over here how the G403 looks like, which I guess a lot of people might be accustomed to, or the Rival 310 with its broken pad over here that's coming off. Yes, I had a lot of worn usage whilst playing Counter-Strike. But anyway, the mouse itself is slightly on the smaller side, so you'll want to bear that in mind. Also, its weight, it's 85 grams for the mouse only. Now that puts it more on the lighter scale, but it's not as light as, let's say, the Razer Viper Mini, which sits on the 65 odd grams. I do prefer around 90 to 95 grams in terms of weight. Again, that's purely subjective and depends on your usage. Now let's Thanos click these mouse away so that we can talk about its performance. Now in terms of the mouse itself, its sensor gets up to 8000 dpi, which is an improvement over the 6000 dpi, which you probably will never use in your lifetime over the first generation. Of course, those RGB lights are also an addition over its previous generation, but as far as I could tell, that's pretty much the biggest differences between the first gen G203 and the second gen, which we've got on video over here. Now in terms of polling rate, it's 1000 Hertz, which is a norm now. It's also got a 32-bit ARM microprocessor, which means you can store one profile on this mouse and therefore use it on another PC without having to have Logitech's G Hub installed. Now in terms of raw performance, I had no issues whatsoever whilst playing Counter-Strike. Its one-to-one tracking was perfect, and depending on the surface I had, I didn't have too much issues in terms of tracking. I will say in terms of its clicks, however, they don't feel as good or as precise as my Roccat 120 Aimo, but again, that's pretty much double the price, if not a little bit more than this mouse, so it's all within reason. Now speaking of clicks, I'm going to go silent over here and you're going to have a little bit of an ASMR section. So now let's talk about the software of the mouse, and in this case is the Logitech G Hub. Now I know a lot of people hate it. Personally, I don't use it, even though I've got a Logitech keyboard and I use on a daily basis. I use the old G Hub. But anyway, this is the program that's here to stay and pretty much what Logitech are pushing out. Now the software itself is a somewhat little bit complicated, but you do have a full list of options, be it from the actual app settings itself to the actual mouse. And what we're going to do is dive into the actual mouse settings. Now here in terms of presets, you can see straight away you're presented with a light sync, in other words the RGB lights. You've got a whole host of options, from screen sampler, which samples what's on your screen, to the audio visualizer, in other words what it picks up in terms of audio. You can have it fixated in terms of color, you can turn it into an RGB rave, you can really ramp up the color so that you really do rave up to some RGB light. You can adjust the brightness. It's all really comprehensive, which is great to see. What I also like is that you can also customize the RGB lights in a little bit more of a fashion than just normal presets. So over here you can see you can set 3 different type of colors, and you can see on your screen over here the mouse just kind of responds to that. I also quite like that the software itself is actually quite responsive, at least on my Windows 10 machine. Then you've got also effects, which are somewhat similar to what you found on the presets, but here you can customize them a little bit more and just have them to your own type of liking. Again, it's all subjective as to if you're going to use this or not. Now, in terms of the assignments, here is where you can see where the G Hub can get somewhat confusing for a lot of people, to say the least. But what they've done is that they've given you a lot of options. So let's say if we click over here, you can disable it or use the default, or you can then search for, let's say, I don't know, 4, and then you can find the button. Like for example over here you can see it's under productivity in terms of commands. If I click on the keys, then you'll see number 4. If I say actions, nothing comes up. Macros, I can create one. System will be, let's say, add an application. So it's a little bit too many options, but that means that you've got a lot of options to play with, and therefore you've got a lot that you can choose with. And in terms of sensitivity, in terms of DPI, you can see over here in terms of scale, you can adjust it by 50 DPI per increment, and it starts from 200 DPI, and as I mentioned before, goes up to 8,000 DPI. I usually use it around 1,300 or so. So on the whole, what I will say with the software, it's really comprehensive and might be a little bit too much for some people, but personally I do like the fact that it does work, at least with my system, and it does provide you all the options that you might or will need for customizing your mouse. And specifically at this budget, it's quite nice to see that Logitech have included all these options. So ultimately, what do I make about the G203 Lightsync? Well, I will say that if you're on a budget, you might want to consider its first generation if you don't want RGB lights, or the fact that you don't really care about 8,000 DPI. If you do care about RGB lights, you might want to consider the Abkoncore A660 instead, purely because that has RGB lights, equivalent performance, and doesn't suffer from that kind of those buttons that I mentioned before with the G203. Of course, your mileage may vary. Let me know in the comments below what you would pick in terms of if you had a budget of around £30 odd or $40 in the US. I'll be very much intrigued to hear your thoughts. As always, guys, I really appreciate your time. I know my videos are a little bit longer than most people's, but I try and get into a lot more detail and try and cover everything as much as I can, as in terms of a consumer point of view, and give you a pretty unbiased, unpaid opinion. And if you do like that, definitely do like and subscribe and favorite and share and all that good stuff. Alright guys, I've been Totally Dubbed. Take care of yourselves. Bye bye.